this part, 8.3, basic XML constructs. All right, so first, let's look at the basic structure of XML elements. So actually, we are familiar with that through HTML. So for this part, we have some experience through HTML. But there is some small difference here. An XML element containing everything from start tag to end tag. The start tag containing attributes, some possible attributes, and the content part of the element can have other elements, nested elements, nested tags. So we have that experience before. Specifically, an element can contain these things: text, attributes, other elements, nested, structure, tree structure, subtree structure, or mix of all these things above. All right. So then there is a special type of elements, empty element. So we have experience on that. For XML, an empty element, the general form is like this. But usually people like to write in this way. Because in this way, first, it is shorter. Second, the XML tools can understand this kind of element easily. And then look at here, a space. So it's better to leave a space. This space, the meaning is its content empty. Empty content for that space. So that's the reason. So if you look at many places when people use empty element, so you can see this space most of the time. All right. Empty elements can still have attributes. Actually, this kind of thing could be very useful. Empty elements with attributes could be very useful. So we have one important example. So here I just record it. In HTML, that image tag, RMG tag, it is an empty element, right? The attribute source, so you provide the location of the image, alt, some text for short explanation, then close it. Close it. Here, in HTML, in a typical HTML document, most of the time people do not close it. Close it in this way. Most of the time, people just close it like this. But remember, if you do it this way, your document cannot pass XML validation. If you do this way, it cannot pass XML validation. Why it is important, XML validation, right? Later, we will see that. If you are really sure you never need to do XML validation, then it's fine. So you can do it. So that's the reason most people, when they write HTML document, so they do not put it in case if there is some special situation, you may need to apply some XML application on this document. Then you will get trouble. So later I will talk about XML validation in more details. So that's in order to avoid that, so you can make this XML way to close that element. Okay? All right. Next, XML naming rules. So when you create new elements, what are those rules? You need to follow certain rules to make a valid XML element names. So here, let us look at some simple rules for element names. All right. First, element names are case sensitive. This probably different from HTML. Not case sensitive in HTML, but here, case sensitive. Second, names must start with a letter or underscore. So not digit or other characters. So the non-letter character, only one you can use, underscore you can use. No other non-letter characters. Okay? Yeah. No digit. Just like HTML, in HTML we do not allow using the first character to be digit. Next one, element names cannot start with these special letters. XML in upper or lowercase, any combination of upper or lowercase XML, you cannot. This name is really, you cannot touch, like, this part. All right. Then, other than the first character, the remaining part, element names can contain letters, digits, hyphens, underscores, and periods. Other than the first character, the remaining characters, other than letters, digits, the special characters, only these three you can use. Right? Hyphens, underscores, periods, but no other characters. Okay? No other characters. So if it is not listed here, you cannot use. Right. Element names cannot contain spaces. Any space, you cannot. Yeah. So, all right. Yeah. So these are the simple rules. Other than that, then you have a lot of freedom to create names for your XML elements. Yeah, so to summarize it, any name can be used. No words are reserved except XML. Okay. So that's something quite different from HTML. HTML. We have so many reserved tag names. Yeah, those tag names, so you cannot. Yeah. But in HTML, you cannot create your own elements, right? Yeah, so it's a different style. So in HTML, you can now create any tag for yourself, because if you create a tag with a name that the browser cannot recognize, the browser will ignore it. Any element that is not reserved word of HTML, the browser will ignore it, treat it as nothing. Okay? But in XML, it's different. Yeah. All right. Next, extensible. So we back to this question. So I explained this extensible thing a little bit before. Yeah. Remember the backward compatibility. The software backward compatibility to make that older version, to make the new versions of application tools running old XML documents without any problem. Yeah. So we're talking about that. Yeah. All right, so here, so let's look at that another time, but we can go quickly. Yeah. So the newer versions of XML applications, when you create a new version of applications, usually you are very likely to add some new elements. But when you add new elements, the old elements can still be used. So old elements, new elements, no conflict. Okay? Yeah. Because the tag name is different. If tag names are different, you won't get any problem. And then the newer version of XML applications can still process the documents using old XML elements. Okay? Because the documents using old XML elements just a subset of the current, the newer version of your XML tags elements subset. Yeah, so the new tool can still display subset without any problem. So that's the meaning of the extensibility issue. Okay? Yeah. All right, so that's this part. Next, XML attributes. So we want to understand XML attributes. All right. First, we can use attributes for XML elements to add some more description on the elements. So you want to add some more characteristics to your elements. So you can use this one. But here there is something you need to make your decision here. Because on the what situation you should use attributes. On the what situation you should use other XML elements. So that decision sometimes not very clear. Here we want to look at that issue. All right. First, attribute value must always be quoted. Yeah, we saw that. Yeah. But when you put quotes around attribute values, you have options, single or double quotes. Yeah. So with these two options, for one special situation, it is very useful. So let's look at this example. Because sometimes the attribute values could contain single quotes or double quotes. Double quotes. Yeah. So let's talk about the containing double quotes situation. Yeah. So look at this. This main attribute, the value, inside the value, we need to use double quote characters. That means you should not use double quotes to, enclose that value. You should not. Otherwise, the parser, XML parser, that later we will talk about parser, the parser cannot understand the structure. The parser will get confused. So you should separate. So here you can see, in this situation, we use single quotes to represent the attribute value, and double quotes will be treated as the literal characters. But there is another way you can solve this problem. You still use double quotes to, identify the attribute value, but the literal double quotes, you use the XML entity. XML entity. Yeah. This way. Yeah. So last time we learned only 5 XML entities, not too many. Yeah. So this is one of the 5 XML entities. So we can use that. Yeah. So typically, these 2 ways we can use. Yeah. All right. Then, so there are no rules about when to use attributes or when to use elements in XML. Here, so this point, it tells us when you design your XML structure, you have freedoms to make this decision. Sometimes something you need to make a decision. Should I use an attribute to describe this specific piece of information, or I just use one special element to do it? Yeah, so that consideration. Sometimes both ways work, but later you can see when you try to improve your version, you will see after some time, one way is not as good as the other. So we can see that. So I will give you a simple example so we can see that. All right. So when you make that decision, these things you need to consider. Attributes cannot contain multiple values, but the elements can. This is an important thing. So if the description information you provide, you may need to include multiple values, then you should use the element way, not attribute way. So for example, so I can give you one example like this. For example, the date. When we describe date information, so you can do, if you use the attribute way, for example, 2020 -10-9, all right? Today's date, right, for example. All right, so that's only the single value you can do. All right. But if you use it as an element, you can handle the multiple values way. For example, suppose we use the date element. Okay? So date element. Then inside we can create a year element. 20, year, month element, 10, and so on. Okay? Things like that. So you need to really consider the situation. Which way is better for your application? So things like that. Okay? All right. Multiple values, single values. Another. Attributes cannot contain tree structures. Elements can. Yeah? So if the information later you need to expand, you need to grow that specific piece, keep growing, then you should use the element way, not attribute way. Extensible. So that particular piece of information has the potential to expand, then you should use the element way. So that's another criteria we need to consider. Attributes, yeah, are not easily extensible for the, yeah, so that's what we talk about, right? Yeah. Further extensible. Yeah. All right, so other than that, so you can make your decision. All right. Next, XML Validator issue we need to talk about. Sometimes we don't care XML validation, but sometimes it could be important. So let's take a look a little bit. Why people will use XML Validator? Because they want to make well-formed XML documents. To do that, you need to, the validator will check the rules one by one to make sure well-formed. For example, must have root element. Okay? And more rules must have closing tag. Okay? Each element must have a closing tag. Case sensitive, right? So when you mention opening, closing tags, you need to make sure the tag names are exactly the same considering the case sensitivity. Okay? Yeah, so that part. Properly nested. You check. Nesting structure, properly nested. Attribute values must be quoted. Here we just list some of the rules. Definitely the validator will check much more than this. There are a long list of rules. So here we do not need to list all of them. Just list a few of them so you can get an idea. All right. What is the consequence? If the validator detects just one single error anywhere, violates, so that document violates one of the rules, what will happen? So the consequence, like this. The basic principle is, with XML, errors are not allowed. No single error is allowed. So you can see very strict. The structure of XML documents very strictly enforced by the XML validators. All right. So the consequence is this. If there is one error detected, so then XML applications won't work. XML applications won't accept any XML document with even single error. So that's why XML validation sometimes is very important. Right. For HTML, we don't have that. Actually, the HTML, the rules, not that strict. Sometimes you make some errors, so that could happen. The browser can still fix it. The browser can still, so not fix it, the browser can interpret it in a correct way. But if your error is too big, if the error is too big, the browser cannot interpret correctly. So the browser will display some very bad way, Yeah. So you will see something really hard to understand. But for XML, you can see the rule enforcement property is quite different. Even a small, tiny problem will cause the whole XML application stop working. All right, so that's this validator problem topic. Last one of this video, XML parser. Parser. When we need to process XML information, we need to use XML parser. So usually, we as programmers, we don't want to do that. Too much tedious work. Nobody likes to do that. So that's, usually we rely on some existing tools to help us process XML documents. So parser creates XML DOM object. Then we just, after the parsing operation, so we get a DOM object. So we can access any element in this DOM object. All right. Yeah, so we can access properties, we can use methods to access and editing XML, internal parts. And modern browsers have built-in XML parser. So many programming languages have XML parsers. So Java has some XML parser. So we can call some special classes you can use to access, to parse, to extract content of XML data. Here, we just consider the browser's case. So for the browser's case, usually we do XML parsing in JavaScript functions. So in our JavaScript function, we can use these lines. First, we use the DOM parser constructor. This is constructor, object constructor. Okay? So we get that object first, DOM parser object. So we have this variable. Okay? Then we do processing. We do parsing. Parser dot parse from string. The text is the XML text we want to process. So then we tell the way to process, encoding, which way, the content type. So this is content type, text/XML. So then, after that, we get this object. So we can retrieve some of the elements from this object. So in the next slide, I will show you a simple example. So let's look at this JavaScript code. So in a JavaScript function, so we can have the XML data like this. String containing XML data. Then we do these two lines. So we get an object ready for accessing in your program. Then, so now we retrieve. So you can see how do we access individual element, value, content inside it. This way. The object, then dot get elements by tag name, title. Here, find the title element. So inside it, find the title element. Title element, you may have multiple title elements. If you have multiple title elements, we use the array way to access. So we treat those elements as an array of elements. Zero index, so that's the first array element. Your first title element. Okay. All right, so you get that one. Then dot child node, because in this element you may have a list of other elements, child elements, list of nodes, right? Yeah. So then nodes, we treat those nodes as array of nodes. So you access the first node, child node. Yeah. All right, so you get the first child node, then you retrieve the node value, the content, the element, the content of that element. Okay? Yeah. So then you display data. Okay? Yeah. So here just give you an idea when we process XML documents. So what is the typical way we do to traverse? So here we do the way traversing XML DOM tree. Yeah. The DOM object is a tree. XML DOM object is a tree. So we need to traverse XML DOM tree. Yeah. All right. So that's pretty much the basic knowledge about XML. Okay. And we pretty much just learn this much. So later when we need more, so we can cover the part we need. So this is the basic background we need, preparing later we can do other technologies. All right, so let me stop here.